Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Adam Dorsay, a psychologist in Silicon Valley and the host of SuperPsyched, a podcast dedicated to supercharging your life. Each episode contains fun, high-quality interviews with experts looking at psychology from all angles. SuperPsyched is your tool to get more of what you want in your life and less of what you don't.
Conflict. It's a word that can conjure up all kinds of negative thoughts, feelings, and images. But conflict gets a bad rap. Because no two humans are carbon copies of each other, we can't really be in a relationship without some conflict. Yet, most of us have not received even close to the required amount of training to handle, let alone be comfortable with, conflict. Fortunately, top-tier help is here. Harvard Law School senior fellow Robert Bordone and Harvard Medical School neurologist Dr. Salinas have teamed up to write one of the most authoritative books on conflict, and it's called Conflict Resilience: Negotiating Disagreement Without Giving Up or Giving In. Yes, you heard me correctly. A law school professor and a medical school physician, both from Harvard, have teamed up to write an awesome book on conflict. And given their areas of expertise, this is easily one of the most comprehensive books on the subject. Daniel Goleman writes, Conflict Resilience offers a powerful, practical recipe for true dialogue between people with opposing views. Robert Bordone and Salinas have written exactly the book needed in our time. I agree fully. So listen in as Bob and Joelle and I talk about conflict resilience and how to foster it in your life. Robert Bordone and Dr. Salinas, a hearty welcome to SuperPsyched.
Thank you so much. Really looking forward to this.
So great to meet you both. I'm so grateful that the two of you have really, really engaged hard in a book for our times. Think about the two of you. We've got a neurologist and a lawyer coming together from both of their areas of expertise, creating what I think is a perfect whole for a book to break down the nuts and bolts of what conflict is, what it isn't, why it exists, why it's important, how to handle it, and why it's crucial that we be able to sit through it through something you will refer to as conflict resilience, which we'll get into. But first of all, so glad to be with you both. And I want to just even say that the word conflict elicits in me anxiety. As familiar as I am with it, as much of a fan as I can be of it, it still carries negative connotations. And the two of you really try to disabuse the reader of this idea that we have around conflict itself, that it should be avoided, that it's a zero-sum game, a whole host of things. Let's talk about the myths and the realities as they relate to conflict as just a starter.
Like you, Adam, I will say that conflict also causes a lot of anxiety in me. My whole professional life has been working in the world of conflict. So that is normal. And I think part of the reason why we associate it with such anxiety is because I think we live in a culture that sees conflict as someone's done something wrong, something's bad. We grew up in families where conflict was either sometimes avoided, sometimes escalated, but rarely handled well. And for reasons that I'm going to let Joelle articulate in a bit, because it's more on the brain, but our brains in some ways were wired, at least around existential reasons, for thinking of it as bad. And yet, the existence of conflict is really something that offers opportunities to get more connected, to build deeper relationships. In fact, you can't have a real relationship with another person without having conflict. And so the question isn't, is there going to be conflict, or are we going to have them, but are the conflicts going to have us? And how can we reframe the way we think about what's possible in conflict?
I agree with Bob. Without conflict, there is no connection. And part of what makes it so challenging is our brains, these amazing, amazing organs that we have, right? hundreds of billions of neurons, hundreds of trillions of connections evolved to really be a fortune-telling machine for us, to really make predictions about what's going to happen based off of whatever information there is in the present and whatever we've gathered from the past. That way we can take actions to help to protect ourselves. And conflict is one of these loaded kind of concepts, because if you think about your own experiences with conflict in the past, it's a good chance that maybe your first experience with a conflict were watching your parents argue, or having an argument with a sibling or somebody at the playground, or something really traumatic. And all these past experiences then inform kind of what registers for you as a potential conflict, but also that salient system, that pay attention network in the brain becomes much more aware of these situations and just registers them as a potential physical threat, using some of the same systems in our brain that actually process information about physical pain. And so this combination of factors does make it much more challenging for you to just grapple with the concept of conflict. And I think it varies from person to person, and there's so much difference in terms of how we each will register something as conflict and how we're able to hold that conflict for ourselves. Something we talk about in our book is around conflict tolerance. But the idea really is that what I may perceive as a really uncomfortable conflict that creates a lot of distress in me may not be the same for Bob or for you, Adam. And so being really aware of our relationship with conflict and our physical experience of it is already more than half the battle in trying to become more resilient in the face of the distress of conflict.
Such a great explanation from both of your perspectives on it. And all the more reason why I think the two of you create such a great whole. I'm wondering, did the two of you ever experience any conflict as you were writing the book? And how did you work through that if you did?
Well, the
If you
answer
ask
is
me.
yes. But there's a funny story to this, right? Because I think, Joelle, you can agree or disagree with this. I think that probably Joelle may have racked more things as conflict than I did. I had 3. He might think we had 6 or something. I mean, mostly because there's this idea we talk about in the book called conflict recognition, that we may have a back and forth that I think of as fun and a debate and interesting. And God, that gave me some things to noodle with. And the other person, in this case could be Joelle, might be thinking, Bob is really upset. Is this project in trouble? What am I going to do now? What are we going to do now? And I think I'm over-exaggerating this, but this did come up a few times, and which is why I might say there's 3 conflicts, and Joel might have said there was more, literally because what we experienced and labeled the conflict was different.
You want to weigh in on that?
Oh my gosh. If you ask me, there was a lot of conflict throughout the process of writing the book, but there was big and little conflicts. And I think the conflicts were necessary just at a fundamental level for us to actually craft a unified voice for the book. I think one of the things I'm proud of in terms of the writing style of the book is that it sounds like it was written by one person.
It does.
And it took a lot of work. It took a lot of work, a lot of us figuring through how we write together and like knowing what's the hill that I'm going to die on today and which ones are okay for just to let it go.
I love that. And yet, one of the things that you let the reader know is that diversity is the winning model for just about everything, and that conflict is inevitable. It's going to happen. And so the book must be better for it. And I'm guessing that somehow it was almost like tuning a guitar, and the two of you came up with what seems to the reader to be a unified voice, even though it was coming from 2 different streams. That's very meta and simultaneous.
Yeah.
So that is really great. You speak frequently about the idea of conflict resilience, and I want to know, what is conflict resilience and how do you grow it?
Yeah, maybe I'll take the first part and you take the second part, Joelle.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I'll say what it is, and Joelle will say how to grow it. At base, we want to really strongly differentiate conflict resilience from conflict resolution. So conflict resilience is just the ability, the capacity to sit with the discomfort of disagreement with others, to kind of hold ourselves in that and be authentic, assertive, to put our viewpoints forward. So in some sense, that we could speak up and not be silenced. And also this ability to kind of listen and perspective take from a place of curiosity and genuineness. And so the reason why it's different from resolution is getting to the solution. We have a negotiated agreement, we solved the problem, and we are very much in favor of that. The thing is, you cannot get to a joint resolution that isn't extremely high cost, like war or violence, without having conflict resilience. So it's prerequisite to the other work. And that is very much what animated this book, was starting to feel like, as individuals, as families, as organizations, and even as country, our ability to sit with that discomfort of the disagreement was going down, which, quite apart from any skills, was hurting our ability to get to any helpful problem solving.
And just to build on that, it's almost like it results in us siloing ourselves rather than interacting and coming to some type of, seeing that.
The other part of your question around how do we build it, I think there's three components to that process. I think one, and your listeners and viewers kind of walk away with one thing, it really is just building that awareness of kind of your experience with conflict and how you relate with it. But again, awareness is more than half the battle here, because that starts to actually reprogram and rewire your brain to be much more attentive of when you are experiencing distress. And you can start to then be able to recruit other tactics and strategies to manage that distress when it does happen. The second component is unlearning. There's a process of unlearning old, we call them default reactions in the book, the 5Fs, the fight, flight, freeze, fawn, and fester. But there could have been many more Fs in that. Really, it's about kind of these reflexive behaviors that we have in response to complex situations. So at some point, it served a purpose. It was beneficial, probably more in the short term by making something bad feeling feel less bad. But it probably didn't serve your long-term goals or needs. And the third piece is really, I think the easiest way to kind of explain it is that it's a bit like building a muscle. You don't go into a gym and start lifting the heaviest weight, doing the most complex kind of power sweep, lift, or whatever those multi-part exercises are. That's the easiest way to get a sprain, right? To injure yourself. And what we're really advocating for is to take an approach where you're starting with the lowest weights possible, get your form right, and then steadily kind of build up the weight so that way you can actually lift the heaviest weights with that good form in a way that you're less likely to get injured. And one way that we think about it is really just being attentive to the kind of distress you're experiencing in different types of conflict, and really focus on those that, not the conflicts where you're super, super comfortable with, but maybe more the ones I would call more of a stretch zone, where you are noticing some distress there, but it's not overwhelming, where you can still have some wherewithal to kind of use some of the techniques that we suggest and kind of do repetitions. In a way, it's a bit like exposure response kind of prevention therapy, where you're using an exposure in a way that's relatively safe up front, where you're really just learning the skills of sitting with that distress without necessarily making it go away immediately. So that way you can build progressively, kind of successively. So that way you can eventually get to a place where you're in a really challenging conflict, whether that's a disagreement with your parent or with a boss, and be able to do it in a way where you're coming at it with clarity and confidence of your perspective, and you're able to respond in ways that are much more strategic.
I love that. We're getting to the nuts and bolts, and you're talking a bit about what we might in psychology refer to even as the zones of proximal development, just the farthest out that you can reach, not making it overwhelming, but making it almost like cookie within reach that you can grab. So I love that idea that you're...
Adam, can I tell you a funny story?
Always.
Around this? I don't know if it's funny or not, but it's a real story. So, our book came out a few weeks ago. And as Joelle knows, I'm very curious about whether it is in bookstores. And
totally.
So I've been like going around, you wrote a book.
I've done that too.
Right?
Yeah, I was so excited to see it in San Luis Obispo over the weekend.
But I have this friend, and she is just anxious about asking questions, right? So I was like, okay, your assignment is you're going to go in and not just ask for the book, but if they don't have it, you're going to ask them if they'd consider ordering it.
Love.
And some of your listeners might be like, who cares, right? What's the big deal? But for others, it's this, and definitely for her.
Other listeners like myself, just hearing that, I can feel my heart rate increasing.
Yeah. Well, same with her. Hey, Joelle, maybe we should do that for the rest of the afternoon. I'll send you in. Because for me, this would be like, what's the worst thing they could say? The worst thing they could say is, how dare you?
I'm disgusted.
I'm disgusted by that question. Or treat you badly.
Exactly.
But anyway, it's just that example of what Joelle was saying. Don't think I have to talk to my sister about our views on immigration reform.
Exactly.
That'd be a great goal to get to. Or maybe how like you really don't want to go to your in-laws this holiday. Do something like, this is a stranger, just try out the skill.
One of the things I love is that there's so much empathy here. Each of you has really leaned into the other's experience. And there's a highfalutin term in psychology called intersubjectivity, the idea that there are two subjective realities. There's each of yours, and then like a Venn diagram, there's a confluent space where the two of you meet. And the two of you have really come up with the nuts and bolts of saying, we need to name the thing to make sure we're talking about the same thing. I would love it if you could share some other nuts and bolts that increase the likelihood of conflict actually going well and being productive, including perhaps the context, perhaps even saying, let's make time to do this at a time when our RAM space isn't otherwise occupied with a massive task that's in front of us now, but let's actually set aside some time and meet. And what are the containers? What are the strategies that increase the likelihood of good outcomes?
One of the things you're talking about, right, which is a big piece of this, is how do you create kind of a conflict resilient greenhouse space?
Exactly what I'm talking about.
To increase the likelihood that you can do some of the work we're talking about.
Yes.
And so I think one thing that we really do talk about is quite apart from the skills and what you say and what Joelle was talking about, right? That self-awareness, all of which are important, inviting people to what we say is a low risk or brave space and putting up some shared norms around the conversation and doing the conversation at a time that isn't the moment when you are most in your kind of emotionally aroused or what we call the limbic irritability moment is helpful. I think the other thing that there's many other things I would say, but one other thing I'll just name is sometimes actually having a conversation about, and this may sound very meta, but I think it's actually helpful, about the way we have experienced bad conversations in the past. We have struggled to talk about our views on fill in the blank, President Trump, or Ukraine, or on how we deal with mom getting older and not being able to drive. That maybe feels too hard to do to even get into that right now. But what I can do is say, what have those experiences been like for you? Can I share what it's been like for me? And what ideas do each of us have how we could do this differently? Because sometimes the only thing you have in common, at least in the beginning, is we feel not listened to, we feel not seen, not heard, hurt. That is a sense of the commonality, right? And then what do I do to say, like, that's not where we want to be. We want to try to figure this out. Let's have the conversation, which is still a hard conversation, but it's a different conversation about how we're going to be able to talk about this in a more constructive way, even understanding that we may still see it very differently.
Beautiful.
I'm a big fan of this conversation about the conversation because I think it helps to open up a bit of vulnerability, but also it shifts it from the topic that's bound to have lots of landmines in it, like lots of emotional landmines, and more about just the experience of how we connect with each other. And it focuses a lot more on more behaviors that each person can take on to be able to cover the hard topics. And I think being able to name that out loud and acknowledge it can be really powerful, even when there's a particular subject that is really distressing for you or uncomfortable for you, just being able to say, this conversation is going to be hard for me because this topic generally makes me uncomfortable. And so it's just really important for me that you give me some extra time to respond. Or I might say some things that will be clumsy and awkward, and just know that my intention is not to offend. I'm just trying to learn how to manage this because it's so uncomfortable for me.
There's this phrase that I would like to say one of us came up with, but that would be untrue. It is literally stolen from an organization I worked with called Seeds of Peace. And it's called Be Raggedy. I think we talk about this in the book. Like, can we just be raggedy? And the idea of raggedy is, I'm not sure how to say this in the right way. I'm going to try. If it lands wrong, will you extend me the grace that I didn't mean it to land wrong? And also, will you have the courage to let me know how it landed wrong? Because otherwise I can't learn.
These are great ideas. This idea of being raggedy and having that kind of flexibility. It seems almost like a jerkiness, but it's far more resilient. To your point, it can handle rougher weather on the seas or an earthquake if you're raggedy. And this really dovetails so beautifully with the words conflict, resilience, and the realities that accompany those words. As I was listening, I believe it was to Joelle, the idea of zooming out and making sure that we're agreeing on the topography. It's almost like the two people become cartographers. Look at the map and see, are we talking about the same things? And make sure that we have a shared vocabulary, a shared taxonomy, like we understand that this is what we're talking about. Because I think that so much of conflict can be misunderstanding in and of itself. And it's almost like gasoline to fire when you have those misunderstandings, and making sure that we're talking about the same things.
In the book, we talk about this framework of name, explore, and commit. And of the three elements of it, I think the most important is the naming, or just the step before where you pause and breathe. But I think that my favorite of the three is the explore, the topography or cartography, where you are doing the deep listening and the effective assertion. And I think for me, at least, that they became much more palpable when I did improv. Which is
the greatest thing ever, right?
It's so good. I used to call it just low-cost group therapy. But it's this phrase of see and be seen really is powerful, because it's making sure that you're aware of that you are letting other people around you kind of be seen, acknowledged for their perspective, what their experience of reality is. And then at the same time, balancing that with you being seen, making sure that your perspective, that your experience of reality is also in that same space. And, what happens from there, it's part of the exploration as well, to see kind of where there is overlap or where there isn't, but at least just getting it out there so both of you can appreciate that we are not the same person. We don't have the same backgrounds. Maybe we are working off of a very different set of facts. Can be really illuminating for helping to be just much more authentic in a relationship.
Love that idea. One of the great ideas from Donald Winnicott, it was conveyed to me, I haven't seen it in writing, but it was conveyed to me that psychological health can be demonstrated by being able to share your experience with another and being able to take in the experience of another. That kind of synergistic mutuality, it runs through every sentence that the two of you write about in this book. I was wondering if you could describe a dire situation, like one of these conflicts that you were either a part of personally or professionally, or perhaps you were helping, particularly in Bob's case, perhaps you were mediating something that seemed like this is not going to work out. And somehow the skills that were described in your book came to the fore, and these seemingly opposing teams mutually won the day.
Gosh. I thought it was funny when you asked this question. I went more to an actual conflict I was in relatively recently than one that I mediated.
All the richer.
But it was quite interesting to me, maybe because it was just salient. This book was about ready to come out, and it was with a student. So this past semester, I taught at Georgetown Law School, and I was a student who was unhappy with the grade they received. And the student wanted an accounting of every single aspect of the grade and how many points and they got. And I should just say, I don't do that. I don't think it's the role of a professor to do it. I don't think professors need to explain the grade they got because actually the students gave rather, because students earn the grade. What I do is provide feedback for further learning. They had been like very clear to the student about this. The student was like not excited about it. And I would say the first 10 minutes of the conversation, the students would kind of come back wanting this accounting. And I would try to do some listening and trying to explain. And each time the student would say, okay, well, I'm just really glad we're aligned on that. I'm really glad we're aligned on that. And about the fourth time I said, so can we just take a step back? So far, I would say we actually are aligned on nothing. I don't mean to be mean, but let's not call something alignment that is not alignment. I think we don't actually agree on any of these things. So I'm very happy to do this other thing, or we should end our conversation. For some reason, that naming of this, he was like, yeah, you're completely right. But I would really like the feedback. Not only did we do the feedback, got this long thank you note afterwards. And that was it. And there's something in our book that we call this tendency to want to put a bow on it. We didn't really agree, but we're saying we agreed because somehow that makes us feel better, but we didn't agree. And I think part of this is to say, Adam, Joelle, and I, we can disagree and it could be okay. You're not a bad person. We could keep working together. And maybe the honesty and transparency of that and that fact we can work through that gives us something that's more real. I mean, I think this is going back to when Joelle says, you can't have connection without conflict. All the yeses don't mean anything until there's that first no. And so for me, like that was just one of those moments. And I wasn't mean. I mean, I think I was very calibrated to where this person was at. And it's something I had to learn as a mediator, though, I will say, because as a mediator, you want to bring the agreement home. But if you hear that they're agreeing and you're pretty darn sure that 3 weeks from now it's going to fall apart because actually you don't think they agree, they just want to get out of the room, you do them a disservice by closing it.
Could not agree more. The idea of artificially conforming to something that both of you know is patently untrue. We have alignment. You caused me to laugh because it was so ridiculous. The idea of we have alignment here in 4 ways and we had alignment here in no ways. And the idea of the brain's desire to almost overcorrect and make it right. And there are so many rich elements to that story. Joelle, do you want to share one perhaps before I get to my final question?
Yeah. I mean, one that comes to mind is when I was in the medical ICU, patient comes in who had metastatic breast cancer. They've had it for a while. They've tried every kind of treatment and they had all sorts of complications from the metastatic breast cancer. It was a very tragic situation. And the family showed up. I think one of the things that was really distressing for everybody on the team was just seeing how this patient had actually been suffering for quite some time. And things were pretty dire for much longer than they probably needed to be. And we tried to get a better sense of what was behind that. And it turned out that the oncologist that had been seeing this patient outside of the hospital had actually been avoiding the hard conversation. Was really afraid because I had a conversation with the oncologist and we ended up having like a group meeting to just talk through things together so we could all kind of together come to a place where we knew what next best step was. But it was a really tough one because everybody was deeply uncomfortable, not just the oncologist, but the whole team, because everybody was just feeling so much distress because the people who were more clinical or medical just they could see that this was very dire. The oncologist was feeling very guilty for not having had that really uncomfortable conversation about transitioning somebody to hospice earlier. We want to be the cheerleader, right? You want to be the person who's always bringing up hope, but then that can also be really challenging for the family later on down where they want to keep pushing and pushing and pushing because that's kind of the expectation that's been set. And then you've got the patient who ends up getting forgot some of these times, especially when they're in a critical situation where they're not able to reflect their own needs or desires. And so we had a meeting where we brought everybody into the room, and it was deeply uncomfortable for everybody involved, different levels for each person. But everybody had an opportunity to really share kind of what their perspective was and what about the situation was really distressing for them. And then we all kind of talked about the patient. If she were in the room seated right here, let's just talk about, what does she want? What are her favorite things? What would she be saying or thinking in this kind of a situation right now? And it became pretty clear for the family in particular, who had been disagreeing about whether to push or to pull back, the amount of suffering she's going through right now, she wouldn't want that. And so we ended up transitioning her to comfort-oriented care. It doesn't get more high stakes than life or death. And it's all the more important why these little disagreements that start out kind of as low stakes or much, much earlier on, it's really helpful to have that resilience so that you can have what was once an awkward conversation rather than when it's no longer awkward in an imperative conversation because you don't have any other choice.
It's so interesting and sad to hear the byproducts, the effects of our yes brains, our agreeableness. We conform to survive. And so to be, quote, disagreeable, to render a diagnosis that is going to most certainly cause profound grief, or to name that we are not aligned, the idea of getting to the truth. Everybody knows we need to get there. And yet there are so many obstacles to getting there in our biological and evolutionary processes that keep us from naming the truth when it's right in front of our very eyes. I'm going to ask you a variation on my final question. If your book has maximum effect on the readers, what would be your dream? We've talked about the intrinsic nature of the book, an extrinsic outcome. Like, what would be just, oh my gosh, this went beyond my wildest dreams?
I think it would be really incredible if we talked about conflict resilience with the same kind of mainstream familiarity as we talk about things like emotional intelligence or other big skill sets. I think it'd be really amazing if it became part of what we all knew we had to learn, just like how we teach sometimes leadership skills or like algebra. It'd be amazing if we learned these conflict resilience skills because I just think it's just so essential for coexistence in a society.
Joelle, I'm blown away by that one. Yes. May it be an integral part of our academic realities, our lexicons, just like Daniel Goleman, who endorsed your book, Emotional Intelligence, I believe was kind of his term to my knowledge. But this is fantastic. Wonderful. Bob, what's yours?
One of the reasons why we always knew the name was going to be Conflict Resilience, precisely for that. We didn't know what the subtitle was going to be. That was a lot of work, but we knew that. Mine would be that this idea would have a profound shift in the nature of political discourse in this country, in the nature of the way we handle differences with our families, and that we would worry less about whether or not we see eye to eye and just find more ways of connecting across lines of difference in ways that are authentic, because that will stop the demonization and that will stop the dehumanization that I think is at base the thing that's going to rip us apart if we continue on the path we're going.
Oh my gosh, the two of you, thank you so much for investing your heartbeats into creating this book that I am confident readers all across the planet need to read and benefit from and put into a use. And amen to the idea that conflict resilience becomes a term that everyone knows and leverages in their lives for the betterment of our species. We need it now more than ever. And thank you so much, both of you, for showing up on my show and talking.
Thanks for having us.
My listeners. Thank you, Adam. Really appreciate
thanks
it.
for your encouragement. And we hope the word gets out there. And thanks for the work you're doing to help us do that. So
right on. I hope the two of you hit it over the Citgo sign.
This is Dr. Adam Dorsay thanking you for listening to SuperPsyched. If you know anyone who might like it or who might benefit from listening, share it. And if you like the episode, please hit subscribe.